Good evening, everyone. I'm Sam Fletcher, assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's public lecture on the Misinformation Age by Professor Cailin O'Connor. Professor O'Connor is associate professor of logic and philosophy of science at the University of California, Irvine, where she's also a member of the Institute for Mathematical Behavioral Sciences. Her work in philosophy of biology and behavioral sciences, philosophy of science, and evolutionary game theory employs formal and computational methods to elucidate the emergence of moral and perceptual categories, conformity, collaboration, and polarization in scientific communities, and the role of power and propaganda in society. For example, in her latest book, The Origins of Unfairness, Social Categories and Cultural Evolution, published by Oxford University Press this year, O'Connor investigates how, in almost every human society, some people get more and others get less. She explores the cultural evolution of the conventions, which piggyback on seemingly irrelevant social categories like gender, race, and religion, showing how inequity can emerge from simple processes of cultural change in groups with those categories under a wide array of situations. The process of learning conventions of coordination and resource division is such that some groups will tend to get more and others less. Thus, those concerned with social justice must remain vigilant against the dynamic forces that push towards inequity. But that's only the second book that she's published this year. Her lecture for us this evening is on her first, The Misinformation Age, co-authored with James Weatherall and published through Yale University Press, addresses the following sort of questions. Why should we care about having true beliefs? And why do demonstrably false beliefs persist and spread despite bad, even fatal consequences for the people who hold them? O'Connor argues that social factors, rather than individual psychology, are what's essential to understanding this spread and persistence of false beliefs. In a political era riven by fake news, alternative facts, and disputes over the validity of everything from climate change to the size of inauguration crowds, what you believe depends on who you know. And if social forces explain the persistence of false belief, we must understand how those forces work in order to fight misinformation effectively. I understand that The Misinformation Age is now available as an audiobook through Audible, but for those of you yearning for physical pages, ink, and binding, we have copies available for purchase and signing by Professor O'Connor in the reception following this lecture from 8 to 9 p.m. This reception and this lecture are possible through funding provided by the American Philosophical Association and endowments from the University of Minnesota's Department of Philosophy. But first, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor O'Connor.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here at University of Minnesota tonight. Yes, as Sam said, I'm Cailin O'Connor. This talk I'm going to give tonight draws most of its material from this book I wrote with James Owen Weatherall, The Misinformation Age. So he's a philosopher of physics who is my colleague at UC Irvine and also my husband. And if you're thinking to yourself, I wonder what that experience was like, writing a book with your spouse, well, I'll tell you, it was complicated. All right, so let me start the talk with a little story. In the 14th century, this travel memoir by an English knight named Sir John Mandeville began to circulate in Europe. Mandeville claimed to have traveled in India and encountered there this plant with little pods on it. And inside the pods, he said, were tiny living lambs. He even claimed to have eaten the flesh of these lambs and found it, quote, wonderful. These lamb plants became known as the vegetable lamb of Tartary, and for the next 400 years, European naturalists thought that this was a real creature. So you can find sketches of these vegetable lambs like this sketch here in medieval naturalist textbooks alongside elephants and tigers, all the other creatures that people in Europe had never seen but knew existed because others had told them so. Of course, there is no such plant, there never was, but it raises a question, which is, how could it happen that literally for centuries, European scholars could actually think that lambs grew on trees? Despite the fact that given all our experiences with plants and animals in our day-to-day lives, this belief seems perfectly absurd. So we're in the middle of what we might call a crisis in misinformation and false belief. And in response to this crisis, I've seen a lot of explanations of these false beliefs that appeal to our individual cognitive biases and blind spots. So for instance, in the wake of the 2016 election in the US and the Brexit vote in the UK, these cases where misleading information played a key role in these public events, there were a lot of analyses that looked at human reasoning and talked about how we're bad at probability, how we have funny reasoning biases, et cetera, et cetera. And these were good analyses, and it's important to understand those things. But they're really only part of the story. And arguably, they're not even the most important part of the story. And the reason I think this is that humans are deeply social learners. Most of our beliefs come directly from other people. So if you think about your scientific beliefs, probably 99% of them were just told to you by peers, teachers, parents, friends. Why do you believe that tomatoes are safe to eat? Probably because your parents told you, eat this, it's good for you. In Europe, people planted tomatoes for hundreds of years, but nobody ate them because everyone believed they were poisonous, and they had heard from all their neighbors that tomatoes were poisonous. Why do you believe that the earth goes around the sun instead of the other way around? Well, I'm guessing because your teachers taught it to you, not because you were somehow able to deduce this from the movements of the bodies in the heavens. Why did I believe for years that daddy longlegs were the most poisonous spiders in the world, but that their mouths were too tiny to bite us? It's because someone told me that in the first grade, and then I found out that wasn't true in the middle of doing a radio interview about my book where I wrote about the social spread of misinformation. So this ability to share knowledge, experiences, and evidence is a powerful resource. This is the seed of human culture. Without it, we couldn't have sent people to the moon, we wouldn't have modern medicine. But it also allows vegetable lambs to thrive. So without this social spread of information, we never would have seen this patently false, practically absurd belief like the vegetable lamb propagate for literally hundreds of years, passed from person to person to person. And for this reason, we think that ultimately, to understand how false beliefs persist and spread, we need to be thinking of human belief as a social phenomenon. Now, when we do that, this means there are a set of factors that we're going to want to understand in thinking about false beliefs, factors that go beyond how each one of us is bad at reasoning about evidence. These are questions like, who do we trust and why? What sorts of social pressures are we all under? Who in our communities is actively trying to mislead us? And how do these propagandists take advantage of our social natures? So in the book, these are the types of big questions that we explore, and we use a particular strategy for trying to answer these kinds of questions. So in large part, we, number one, make use of historical case studies, like the vegetable lamb, and number two, use mathematical models to try to better understand these social factors of belief. By mathematical models, what I mean is that we use computer simulations where we try to represent real people, real social networks, and then we study these computer simulations, these representations, see what happens there, and then try to use those as lessons to understand the actual spread of false beliefs in the real world. So in this talk, I'm not going to go into a lot of details about this mathematical modeling work. I'll mostly talk about results from this work. But if people are interested, we can of course talk more about this in the Q&A, or you can always read the book, which, as Sam said, I will be happy to sign for you. All right. So here's an outline for the rest of the talk. What I'm going to do is pull out 3 bits from the book that I think are interesting and say a bit more about them. So the first thing I'll talk about is conformity and polarization. The next is industry intervention in scientific belief. And then last, I'll talk a little bit about journalists and the way journalism can unwittingly promote false beliefs. Now with that, it is time for another historical story. You'll see I like historical stories. This one is about a woman named Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was a British aristocrat who traveled to Turkey in the early 1700s with her husband, who was the Turkish ambassador. Lady Montagu had survived smallpox in her youth and had actually had a brother die of the disease. And while she was in Turkey, she encountered this practice she had never heard about in England called variolation. Variolation, if you haven't heard of it, is a lot like vaccination. It involves scratching the skin of a patient, introducing liquid from a smallpox pustule. And then what happens is that the patient will develop a very mild case of smallpox and after that be immune to the disease. So essentially in the early 1800s, women in Turkey knew how to vaccinate people against smallpox. Lady Montagu was traveling at the time with her personal physician, a man from England named Charles Maitland. And Maitland, along with a Turkish nurse, variolated Montagu's own son on the trip. Now, when Montagu returned to England, she tried to spread this practice of variolation, but she met a huge amount of resistance. The English physicians she tried to share it with were skeptical. They didn't want to variolate their own patients. Even Maitland, who had performed the variolation in Turkey and knew that it was safe, was hesitant to do the same thing under the eyes of other British physicians. So what we see in this case is this beneficial practice, something that can save people's lives. In fact, there was a smallpox outbreak, ravaging London at the time, and over 50% of people who caught it died from the disease. We had people who had good information about this practice. They knew it was safe and that it worked to prevent smallpox, but this good belief was failing to take hold. Why was this happening? So in the early 1950s, the famous Asch experiments showed that humans have strong biases towards conformity. We don't like to stick out from a crowd. We find that socially uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to disagree with other people. It's uncomfortable to be saying things that other people disapprove of. Okay, so what did the experiment involve? In it, subjects would be shown these lines, and they'd be asked to pick the line on the right that matched the one on the left. So let's actually take a little vote. So take a minute and think for yourself which one you think on the right matches the one on the left. So please raise your hand if you think it is line 1, line 2. Okay, who thinks it's line 3? You are correct. Well done. You're all good at judging the relative sizes of lines. There was no trick here. But what would happen in the actual experiment is there would be 7 confederates of the experimenter, and they would all say they thought line 1 was the one that matched the line on the left. So they'd say line 1, it's 1, it's 1, it's 1. And then when they got to the actual experimental subject, they'd have to make a decision. Do I pick the line that everyone else has chosen, or do I pick, let's not do that. No, okay. What just happened? Minnesota Talk. Okay. I can't even see my little thing. Hold on, I'm gonna disconnect for a minute here. Don't worry. Come on. Yay! Okay. All right, so what would happen is about 30% of subjects would actually pick the wrong line. They would pick line 1 to fit in with everyone else, despite the direct evidence of their senses that, in fact, line 3 was the proper answer. And they did this because they wanted to conform. They didn't want to say something that didn't match what the other subjects had said. Now, in the variolation case, it seems likely that a tendency of this sort was at play. The physicians didn't want to stick out from the pack. They didn't want to disagree with the other English physicians. They didn't want to do something that nobody else was doing. Even Maitland, remember, who knew that variolation worked and that it was safe, didn't want to do it when these other English physicians were around. So something we ask is, how does conformity bias influence the flow of information or of scientific beliefs in general? How does it affect the spread of knowledge? So using models, we find that conformity biases tend to make the beliefs of a community worse, and this is for a few different reasons. So first, individuals who conform do not pass on accurate evidence or information to those in their social networks. So individuals like Maitland might have really good evidence about a belief, but because he's trying to conform with other English physicians, he's not sharing that evidence with them. He's not telling them what he saw, what he thinks is true. I had a little case where I did the same thing recently. So I was sitting outside my kid's dance class talking with another mom. She was talking about how she had to have skull surgery, and apparently the inside of the skull is covered in tiny little spikes. And I said something like, "How bizarre. Why on earth would we ever?" And she said, "Why would God ever make our skulls that way?" And I had been on the verge of saying, "Evolve to have our skulls that way." And instead I said, "Right." And religious beliefs aside, you know, evolutionary theory is true, but I didn't share that with her because I knew it would be really socially uncomfortable to do so. I knew that I risked our relationship in doing that. Second, individuals who conform often take actions that don't reflect their accurate underlying beliefs. So even when people have good beliefs that could guide their actions well, they might not employ them so as not to stick out. So here's Maitland, he knows this thing works, but he's not practicing it. He's not saving people's lives from smallpox because he's trying to conform. And lastly, we find in our models that conformity can cause polarization. So you've probably heard this buzzword, polarization. This is what happens when you have multiple camps in one larger society or community who can't agree on something or maybe even come to disagree and more over time, despite the fact that they're discussing some issue. So in the US public, we see polarization over issues like gun control or building the wall. Even though we have debate over these issues, we don't see a consensus emerging. So here's a little illustration of how that can happen in our models. I made this very high quality graphic for you to try to make clear how this works. Can you see the network connections between the individuals? Okay, they're kind of in white. They're slightly lighter. Yeah, not showing up great. But okay, suppose we have a network of individuals who are trying to figure out how something in the world works. For example, is there some way to protect people from smallpox? I drew them as tiny scientists here because, or not drew them, made them tiny scientists here because they're trying to find out about the world. And let's suppose that, like the English physicians, this group happens to have bad beliefs. That's what these purple circles mean. They don't know that variolation works. And then lastly, suppose that, like real humans, sometimes they have cliques or clusters in their social network. So on the left over here, these might be the English physicians. They're closely networked to each other, but only loosely networked to Turkish nurses. So suppose someone in this network finds out that variolation works. Here she is. That blue circle means she has the correct belief. This individual might be able to spread their information and good knowledge to peers in their network. But an individual like this one, who's tightly connected with non-believers, will want to conform to their neighbors, and so may refuse to take up this new practice or share any information about it. That individual may receive good evidence about something like variolation due to their connection to others who do know about it and develop a good belief, but because they don't start variolating, their peers don't learn about it and don't develop a better practice. So we see these stable, different beliefs in the community, despite the fact that there's a good belief out there. Now, we think that this case, which we might call the case of the first anti-vaxxers, might actually tell us something about modern anti-vaxxers. So one thing we know about anti-vaxxing is that people who resist vaccination tend to cluster in tight-knit communities. Not all of them, but many of them. So to give a few examples, there are many, especially New Agey or far leftist communities in California where vaccination rates are in the low double digits. Orthodox Jewish communities in Brooklyn have very low vaccination rates, and here in Minneapolis, the Somali American community also has low vaccination rates. So they tend to reside in these cliques or clusters in our social networks. Now, we think conformity may help explain why more information doesn't necessarily help rehabilitate the beliefs of these groups. So we can ask, why doesn't it work to just give people more information about how safe vaccines are? Well, there are several factors that we think are at play here, but one is probably conformity. These are tight-knit groups where individuals have friends and neighbors who aren't vaccinating. If they change their mind and vaccinate their children, they're sticking out from the crowd. They're risking social disapproval. And we also think that anti-vaccine advocates know how to take advantage of this kind of social structure. So if you look at the Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn and the Somali American community here, they've both been the targets of anti-vaccine campaigns. So for example, Andrew Wakefield, he was the physician who initially published this fraudulent study showing a link between autism and vaccines, has come to Minneapolis multiple times to try to convince Somali Americans here not to vaccinate. Anti-vaccine groups have flyered Somali American community centers here. They even went door to door after there was a measles outbreak in Minneapolis, trying to convince people in the Somali American community that that outbreak had been started by the US government to get them vaccinating again, which is nuts. And by the way, returning to Lady Montagu, she did end up managing to spread the practice of variolation in England. And what she did was actually take advantage of people's conformist tendencies. So the way she did that was convincing Princess Caroline of Ansbach, who was married to the King of England at the time, to variolate her own two young daughters publicly, which did two things. It was a sort of public demonstration of the safety of variolation. But second, and maybe more importantly, it showed other people that if they wanted to conform to what the most important woman in the country was doing, they also should variolate their children. After that, many aristocrats fell in line, especially those who knew the two women personally. Okay, so with that, let's move on and discuss our next topic, which is industry influence on science. And let's start with another story. So in the early 1950s, Consumer Digest published an article titled "Cancer by the Carton," which brought to the public the growing body of evidence that cigarette smoking caused cancer. In the following few quarters, tobacco sales dropped for the first time in literally decades, and the heads of the heads of the major US tobacco firms panicked. So 6 of them got together and they hired a public relations company out of New York City to fight this growing consensus that their product was killing its users. Now, the strategy they ended up deciding on with this public relations firm was one that hadn't really been used before. What they decided they were going to do was to fight science with science. In their book Merchants of Doubt, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway dub this fighting science with science the tobacco strategy. And they describe how often the exact same group of men, so literally the same people, used very similar strategies to shape public belief with respect to nuclear war and strategic defense, to try to keep people from understanding the dangers of secondhand smoking, to hide the dangers of CFCs and ozone depletion, to paper over the connection between coal, smoke, and acid rain, and most recently, to fight consensus on global climate change. So this tobacco strategy is very effective, and it's had massive public health implications, not good ones. So part of the reason we talk about the tobacco strategy is that this strategy and similar methods are striking because they often do not involve fraud of any sort. Industrial and political groups often don't need to buy or bias individual scientists. Instead, they have strategies that allow them to bias the overall body of evidence seen by the public. These efforts can be subtle, they can be difficult to identify, and very effective, often more effective than outright fraud would have been. So I think there's this sort of naive conception of the way that industry influence on science works, which is that someone has a briefcase of money which they dump into a scientist's lap and they say something like, get me a study showing that tobacco doesn't cause cancer. And then the scientist produces that study. But that's really not how it works. And in this part of the talk, I want to try to make clearer to you why that isn't the way industry influence typically proceeds in science. So there are a bunch of subtle tactics used by industry to influence science, but I'll just talk about two today. One that we call selective sharing, and one that we call industrial selection. So let's start with selective sharing. What is it? Well, this strategy involves taking real scientific findings produced by independent scientists that happen to spuriously support industry views and then sharing these widely. So to give a little example, these tobacco firms, along with their public relations firm, formed a group called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee in the mid-50s. Supposedly, this research committee had a goal of just checking to see whether tobacco was in fact dangerous, but of course they were in fact a propaganda body. One thing they would do is produce pamphlets, which they would send to thousands, tens of thousands of doctors, journalists, politicians, and members of the public. And these pamphlets would include lines like, 9 studies show no link between tobacco and cancer. Now, that would be a true statement. They would just fail to mention the 50 other studies that had in fact found a link between tobacco and cancer. So they're sharing real scientific results. There is no fraud, but they're taking advantage of the fact that scientific evidence is probabilistic. Not everyone who smokes gets cancer. Not everyone who gets cancer smokes. This means that sometimes when you do studies on the connection between tobacco and cancer, you'll find no connection. You'll have a study that shows tobacco smoking is safe, and then industry can widely share just these studies. Now here is another high-quality graphic trying to illustrate what these models look like. So now here we've got some scientists who are trying to figure out something about the world. So maybe they're trying to figure out, is there in fact a link between tobacco smoking and cancer? Then on the left, we have policymakers or members of the public who don't do these studies themselves, but who are interested in the findings of the scientists, are paying attention to their research. And then we have one more actor in our model who's a propagandist, down here on the bottom right. And this person isn't producing research, they're not trying to develop good beliefs. All they're doing is taking every study that spuriously supports some industry-preferred view and sharing those studies with members of the public. So here's what we find in this model. Without a propagandist, all the observers eventually believe what the scientists come to believe. And this is because in the model, they're seeing real unbiased results, which are going to tend over time to push them to the belief cigarettes are dangerous. So some studies won't find any link between tobacco smoking and cancer, but then many of them will, more of them will. When we add a propagandist, this process always slows down, and in many cases, it reverses. So in other words, this selective sharing of real, independently produced data can sometimes completely mislead the public, lead them to think that smoking is safe. And in the actual case, we saw it taking probably 20 years for what was already consensus in industry circles to actually read the public. So if you look at industry memos, it was clear that by the mid-1950s, they knew that smoking caused cancer and death. The public didn't really come to that consensus until the mid-1970s, and as a result, legislation on this dangerous product was delayed by literally decades. Hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of this strategy. Now, one thing we find in our models is that this strategy is harder to do when scientists run studies with larger samples or just studies of high quality. And the reason is that when they do that, there are fewer findings for a propagandist to weaponize. So when you're in this sort of regime, every misleading study becomes enormously powerful, very effective at misleading. Every misleading study becomes a weapon that the propagandist can use to their ends. When scientists produce fewer such studies, it benefits the public. Okay, so here's an odd takeaway from this part of the talk. Just because a scientific finding is real, and by this I mean gathered by real scientists, even using ideal methods, does not mean it isn't misinformation. The context in which it is shared and the intent shape whether a real finding is in fact misinformation or not. So here's the second strategy I'm going to talk about today. It's called industrial selection. So this strategy was first named and analyzed by two other philosophers of science, Bennett Holman, the bearded fellow on the left, and Justin Brunner. So here's what industrial selection involves. It involves funding scientists who are already using methods favorable to industry findings. And in this way, a body of evidence produced by a scientific community can be biased again without ever corrupting individual scientists. So if you look at real scientific communities, you often see variety, a variety of methods, a variety of assumptions, a variety of background beliefs. What some interest group can do is look at this community, pick out just those scientists who use the methods, who have the assumptions, who have the background beliefs that are favorable to whatever they're trying to sell, and fund only those scientists. And what they do then by giving these scientists money is allow them to create more results showing the kind of thing that that scientist shows. They can create more results. If they have money, they can have conferences, teach other people their methods. They can have students who they train, who go off and use these same methods. And so you can end up with a glut of studies showing what industry wants to be shown, even though the scientists weren't corrupted just because money went the way industry wanted it to go. Now, there's another important thing about this strategy, which is that later, if a scientist is challenged about taking industry funding, they can honestly say, that funding did nothing to change my methodologies or beliefs. And this is really important because scientists decide what other scientists to trust in learning from them. So if they have a peer who can honestly say, no, industry didn't shape what I did at all, that's enormously powerful in convincing them that this is real, trustworthy research. So Bennett and Justin identify a really good example of this, which happened in the 1970s. Researchers had noticed that arrhythmias tend to precede heart attacks, and thought that maybe stopping arrhythmia would be a good way to stop heart attacks. So they started researching antiarrhythmic drugs. But some doctors were looking at whether these drugs stopped arrhythmias, and other drugs were looking at whether they stopped death by heart attack. And industry funded only people in this first group who were seeing whether they stopped arrhythmias. As a result, people in this first group published a lot, they got prominent positions, and in fact, on the basis of their success, many of them got government grants to keep studying whether these drugs stopped arrhythmia. And they did stop arrhythmia, which meant that pharmaceuticals could manufacture and sell these antiarrhythmic drugs. But the problem was, I'm guessing you probably see where this is going, they caused heart attack deaths. This wasn't discovered for nearly 10 years, and over that time, it's been estimated that upwards of 100,000 people may have been killed by antiarrhythmic heart drugs. So a takeaway here, industry influence can be tricky, it can be subtle. It often takes advantage of the norms and social structures of scientific communities, because scientists are under a lot of pressure not to commit fraud. They don't really want to. They'd be judged by their peers if they did. So it's better if there are ways to influence science without making scientists commit fraud. Furthermore, this is a problem because it can lead us to misdiagnose the presence and strength of industry influence on our scientific beliefs. And I want to give an example of this kind of misdiagnosis. So Jim and I recently got into, Jim's my husband and co-author, we got into a little email spat with one of the authors of this article, the made-up story about how Big Sugar shifted the blame to fat. So in the 1960s, Big Sugar was funding research on the link between fat and heart disease. What these guys argue in this Slate article is that they did not, in fact, influence the course of science because they were only funding scientists who already thought that fat caused heart disease and who were already looking at fat as a cause of heart disease. But that's exactly industrial selection. And then because the authors of this article are naive to the subtleties of industry influence, they end up defending industry here. In this case, if you actually talk to these researchers who were given this money from sugar, they'll say, look, they didn't change what I was doing. I was just doing my research. I just got some money from them and continued to do my research. So they do defend themselves. And I believe they weren't really influenced by sugar. But that doesn't mean that sugar wasn't able to corrupt the scientific process nonetheless. And so we wrote our own piece. You're wrong on the internet. Okay, so with that, let's move on to the last thing I want to discuss in this talk, which is journalism. So we've seen that the tobacco strategy involves biasing this body of evidence seen by the public. This is either by just sharing some studies or by shaping what studies are created in the first place. Given the effectiveness of the tobacco strategy, we should be thoughtful about institutions that curate science for the public, institutions that shape what we see when. Now, in particular, I want you to consider journalists whose job includes communicating facts and scientific results to the public. So, journalists adhere to many different norms and rules. I'm going to give you one example here. So from 1949 until 1987, the FCC required broadcast license holders to present controversial issues in a fair manner. And in practice, what this ended up meaning was that different sides of a debate were given equal airtime regarding that debate. And sometimes this was very important in promoting minority political views, for example. But it was also employed even in cases, such as over the health risks of tobacco, where one of the sides speaking had overwhelming scientific evidence. So today that FCC rule is gone, but the both sides ethos remains, witness climate change. So for decades, it was often the case that when media covered climate change, they would have one expert on each side of the debate who would each be given a chance to speak about climate change. So we look at a model where, again, we assume that there are unbiased researchers testing the world. These are the researchers. And so good at this. Members of the public who want to know the truth. And now we assume there's some journalist who is curating this data, passing on information about scientific studies to members of the public. In our model, we assume this journalist can use one of two journalistic strategies. So either they can pass on information about all the data that's been collected by scientists, or they can pass on data about two studies, one from each side, one showing climate change is real, one showing maybe not. And what we find is that paradoxically, this kind of fair reporting in scientific cases leads to dependably worse results. Because what's happening is that journalists are overweighting evidence for the worst belief because evidence tends to support better beliefs. So if we look at climate change, for example, there are going to be more studies out there showing climate change is real because science in general, in most cases, tracks the truth at least to some degree. So when you do fair reporting, it's actually not fair. It's actually promoting the worst belief in almost every case. A better strategy in a case like this involves surveying and reporting on the entire body of evidence in a literature rather than trying to represent just some parts of it. Now, a takeaway here is that even unbiased journalists who are adopting industry best practices can promote false beliefs. Fairness, though, is only one mechanism by which this can happen. So other mechanisms by which journalists can accidentally act as propagandists include, first, novelty bias. So there's enormous pressure on journalists to create fascinating pieces that are going to drive readership, that are going to get clicks. And people, in fact, love new and surprising scientific results. But the problem is that surprising scientific results are often surprising for a reason, which is that they're false. So when journalists focus on new or surprising results, they promote false findings more often than not. Another issue involves reporting on the existence of a false claim or finding. Now, this is a little tricky because sometimes the fact that people believe or say false things actually is news. But when you report on it, sometimes you end up spreading a vegetable lamb. So, for example, are people familiar with Pizzagate? Okay, so this was the conspiracy that Hillary Clinton was running a child prostitution ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. Unsurprisingly, this started on 4chan and quickly moved to Reddit, but it didn't get wide viewership until national news began reporting on the existence of this conspiracy. And then as a result, many more people, even though they were saying, well, this conspiracy is ridiculous, it's false, many people went onto the internet and then ended up thinking, well, this is probably true. And of course, that guy took a gun there and tried to shoot, I don't know. But yeah, so just saying false thing is false can sometimes just leave people with only false thing. And last, journalists often report on single studies, which makes no sense given the probabilistic nature of scientific evidence. One study can always mislead you, can make you think maybe cigarette smoking is safe. A body of evidence is a much safer bet. And I wanted to give a few examples of this that cracked me up. Here's the first one. Science says a glass of red wine can replace 1 hour of exercising. Now, this was actually based on a study of nonagenarians, so people over the age of 90, and it found a correlation between one glass of wine and longevity that was stronger than the correlation between exercise and longevity among these nonagenarians. But this was one study. Furthermore, I talked to the authors of this study, and they want you to know that a glass of red wine cannot replace an hour of exercising. In fact, they think that red wine itself is not good for your health, that it just has a correlational effect, that people who have a lot of friends and who are happy tend to drink more, and in fact, being happy and have friends is the thing that causes you to live longer. Here is, so stop sharing on Facebook like, Aunt Jill, this heading. All right, one more. And forgive me, I really couldn't resist this one. So this is from the New York Times. Magnets lessen foot pain of diabetics, a study finds. And I just wanted to highlight a few bits from this article for you. First, Dr. Weintraub emphasized that his study was small, involving only 24 patients. So we start with a low quality study. Next, this study runs counter to many previous studies that have failed to show any beneficial effect from treatments with magnets. So there's already a body of evidence showing this thing is probably not true, a single study showing a finding. Weintraub says, we have no idea how or why the magnets work. That should have been a red flag. And here, 14 years later, national briefing, again in the New York Times, Science and Health, for foot pain, forget magnets, it seems. All right, so to wrap up, today I haven't focused much on the special features of current internet misinformation and disinformation. But in concluding, I wanted to draw a few connections between what I've said and internet misinformation, and of course we can talk more about this in the Q&A. So first of all, social media gives new opportunities for conformist bias to influence us, especially given that we're often selecting and curating our own networks. And propagandists can take advantage of this. So, for example, Russian agents, before the 2016 election, targeted Bernie supporters by making them think that other Bernie supporters were not going to vote for Hillary Clinton. And they did this because they know people have a conformist bias, and so if they tell them the people like you are not going to do this, they're more likely not to do it themselves. Second, social media gives propagandists new direct connections to the public. So now reaching you is very easy for industry, for political groups, and for foreign agents. To give a little example, I know someone who received a private Facebook message from what looked like the real organizers of the Women's March last January, telling her it was canceled and she didn't go. Of course, this was actually some shady interest group who managed to pose as someone she knew and trusted, and was only able to do that because of social media and the flexibility it provides to propagandists. Last, journalists face new, sometimes counterproductive incentives online. So in an era where we don't sit down to watch a news show or read an entire paper, we're instead reading individual articles, and this creates an enormous pressure for these articles to be novel, to be fascinating, to be surprising, to draw us in to read them. But notice that that incentive does not necessarily line up with incentives for journalists to lead you to have good, accurate beliefs. And I want to say one last thing, which is that you shouldn't assume you know what misinformation or disinformation look like online. So we've seen how subtle and effective industry influence on science was. We've seen how easy it is to miss that influence or to think it wasn't happening because we assume we know what it looks like. Online misinformation and disinformation can be the same. There are many people who know a lot about influencing us and who have strong incentives to do so. Furthermore, as misinformation evolves online, we should expect it to keep changing form. In the run-up to the 2016 election, we heard a lot about fake news, literal sites with literal fake news articles. You don't see those anymore. It's because we all learned they were fake and it stopped being effective. But now there are new forms of misinformation intended to get under our radars. Misinformation is something we're going to have to be ready to keep fighting and keep thinking about if we want to protect our democracy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Cailin. So we have about a little short of 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. I may not call on you in the order in which I see you,
Are the same forces and biases that govern people's susceptibility to new misinformation in the first place the same ones that govern people's resistance to taking evidence into account that would dispel their already held beliefs? And also, are there shared characteristics that the least gullible, the least susceptible amongst us have?
Shared characteristics that the least gullible or the least susceptible. So, okay, let me take the first thing first, which I think what you were asking was, are the things that get us to believe new false things the same kinds of things that keep us from believing new true things? Are those two things symmetric? I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I mean, if we look at different examples, like the conformist bias case, well, it kind of depends probably actually which cases you're looking at. So there we had a situation where a lot of people were resisting uptaking new beliefs because of conformist bias, right? But sometimes conformist bias can also lead people to uptake false beliefs because some friend of theirs says such and such false thing is true and they take it up. Yeah, I guess I don't know. I'd have to think more about it. As far as like the things that make people least gullible, we focus a lot less on individual psychology and like who are the best people at reasoning about things in this book, and much more on, okay, what are the social aspects that make us good at reasoning? But there are a few things that can help with these social aspects. So one thing that I encourage people to do, for example, is not to necessarily base your trust of things you hear on whether you like the person you're hearing them from. So we all use these heuristics for trusting each other that are based on, is this person like me? Do I somehow like them? Are they popular? Are they well-liked? We also use other heuristics like, are they knowledgeable about this topic? But it's much better to look at an original source. So was something printed by the New York Times? Well, trust that, not basing your trust on who shared it with you.
Sorry, down here. This was excellent, thank you. So I wondered if you could say more about how, so returning to the idea of anti-vaxxers kind of taking advantage of tight-knit communities. So it seems to me that what's going on in these cases isn't just that like the tight-knitness of the communities is being taken advantage of, but it seems that like, especially like in the case of like Somali Americans, it seems that what people like Andrew Wakefield are doing is they're taking advantage of an actually arguably very reasonable mistrust that Somali Americans might have of the medical establishment, right? Because you have this community where you have lots of immigrants who are members of a racial minority in a country where there's a long history, right, of surreptitious medical experimentation on black people, and that we have a government right now that's super hostile to immigrants. And it seems like the source of some of their fears about vaccines are actually quite reasonable, even though, you know, I do believe, as you do, that, you know, vaccinating is the right thing to do. Can you say more about how these sorts of things can kind of complicate these situations? Yeah.
Yeah, great. So when I was talking about conformity in vaccines, I said something like, there's a lot of things going on in this case, and one of the most important things going on, I think, has to do also with social trust and who trusts who. And in particular, another reason that people who don't vaccinate are often resistant to evidence coming from others is because they don't trust them. And sometimes that lack of trust is actually grounded in pretty good reasons. So as you point out, there might be really good reasons for Somali Americans not to trust physicians. It was also pointed out to me by someone else that often anti-vaccine advocates are women, mothers, and sometimes they have very good reasons not to trust doctors or the medical establishment as well. So there are these kind of multiple factors at play. Another thing we examine in the book is social trust and lack of social trust, and discuss how that, separately from conformity but also together, can cause polarization on its own. If you end up with different people holding different beliefs and where they just don't trust the evidence coming from the other group for whatever reason.
I know nothing about meteorology, but I'm absolutely convinced about climate change. And I know that 97 or 98% of the scientific studies support concerns with climate change. Why should I trust that?
Why should you trust that? Good. So we end up arguing in the book that we should trust scientific evidence, not for the reason that scientists are experts on this topic, but for the reason that they're engaged in processes that have been tested over time and shown in the past to work, not perfectly, not 100%, but to work damn decently at finding true things out about the world. And if you look at the evidence in the case of climate change, as you said, the vast, vast majority of it shows us that this is in fact happening. Now, in this particular case, there's more of a wrinkle, which is that you can also look at the history of propaganda and diagnose why anyone doesn't believe in climate change. In fact, there's no reason for anyone to hold that belief based on scientific reasoning. It's that, in the 70s, Exxon and these other oil companies found out that people were getting worried about oil and gas because of climate change. They determined that, yes, climate change was real. You can look at their internal memos and find that they all thought this. And they decided, okay, we're going to start a misinformation campaign to convince everyone that it isn't real. So we both have enormous evidence showing that it's real and reasons why anyone would think otherwise. So that's why you should trust it.
In the middle here on this side.
So I know you only briefly touched, excuse me, I know you only briefly touched on the way that the internet can spread these things, but it seems like a place like Facebook specifically can be a breeding ground for the confluence of, say, algorithms prioritizing things that you've already liked or already engaged with, plus also actively showing you what the people in your social group are sharing and things like that. So with this, where do you see all of this heading when we do have people being separated further and further into little factions and little bubbles of ideologies, especially on the internet?
Well, so one thing that we end up arguing in the book, a lot of people are resistant to the idea that social media sites should be asked to change their algorithms, especially their promotion algorithms, to fight misinformation, because a lot of people respond to that by saying, oh, it's an impingement on free speech for them to do so. But I think it's important to recognize they already are completely shaping what we see on these sites using various algorithms. They're not algorithms intended to get us to believe a particular thing, but they often are taken advantage of by propagandists to get us to believe false things, and so they often create these kind of toxic or misleading informational environments for social media users. I hope that going forward, we hold social media companies accountable for designing their spaces in the ways that best promote true beliefs. Now, there's no easy way to say how that's done. It's going to be like, that's a messy, ongoing, weird thing to have to do. But I think they have to try, and we have to try to get them to try, because otherwise we're just in this soup of misinformation that's uncontrolled and is really harmful and damaging to all of us.
I can go real quick. Okay, you said something about the FCC rule about fairness being terminated back in the 80s. What was it specifically that caused them to do that? And why do you think that the ethos of fairness has persisted to today, even when they canceled that rule back in the 80s?
Yeah, okay. So the thing is, the FCC won't let me be, or let me be me. So let me see. I have no idea is the answer.
So one thing that I noticed that plays a huge factor in how information is spread that wasn't mentioned here is institutions that are essentially governing entire bodies of people, whether it be religious institutions or government. And this is sort of an age-old problem that we've seen all the way back to Copernicus's heliocentric theory, where despite his evidence, he was essentially burned at stake because the Catholic Church controlled the flow of information. And we still see this today when people who are in high government positions are directly invalidating scientific evidence and journalists that oppose them. And my question is basically, what are the patterns of society that, like what patterns of society are present when people sort of shift from believing their governing body to believing the scientists, if that happens?
So I'm not totally sure about the actual question, but so this point you're making about how governments and these like large bodies end up mattering to belief is a really important point. And I think one way to think about this generally is that there are a lot of people who have something at stake in controlling what we believe. Some of those people are the Russian government, some of those people are Doritos, are big tobacco, are big oil and gas, but also the US government, also various churches. All of these groups have reasons that they want people to believe some things and not others, because they have interests in how society is shaped, right? One thing like we end up arguing is something like, we need to, as best as we can, separate out governmental working from the working of science. And we sort of have an issue with our current democratic structure, which is that the way we vote ends up de facto sometimes being a vote about what is scientifically true. So we vote for someone who's not going to act on climate change. De facto, we're voting to say this isn't real. Whereas, of course, what we believe and the way we vote in no way shapes what's scientifically real. There are a lot of ways democracies are shaped. So one thing we argue is that we should try to be shaping the way our democracy works so that it represents our values without representing our scientific beliefs, which we know are often really bad.
And sort of a follow-up of that, so one example would be like after Copernicus, there was an entire scientific revolution that changed the way people saw the world. And there have been similar shifts throughout history, like waves between like scientific evidence and then faith and back and forth. And so like, what sort of changes or patterns are present that cause that to happen?
What sort of changes or patterns? Is there something you have in mind by changes or patterns?
So for example, like, when lots of people start switching their beliefs from one thing to another as a society, what are the factors influencing that?
Yeah, I mean, often these processes where you have a whole society going from believing one thing to another thing are immensely complicated. So they often involve all sorts of factors, things like social trust, things like social network structure, things like who are the influence bodies involved trying to get people to believe different things, what's the informational structure. I mean, for these things, you almost have to look case by case to really understand how each one went. You know, why did people eventually, for the most part, come to believe in evolutionary theory, even though for years and years they resisted it? It's a very big, messy answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Cailin.
Thank you, guys.
It's about time for us to go to the reception age. However, you'll have to check out the platters yourself to see whether or not we have any vegetable lamb. Please join me in thanking Professor Cailin.
That was just terrible.